August 5th, 1192. The merciless Palestinian sun beat down on the limestone walls of Jaffa as Richard Plantagenet, King of England and self-proclaimed Sword of Christendom, gazed across a tactical situation that should have marked the end of his legendary career. From the harbor where his 35 remaining ships rode at anchor, the Lionheart could see Saladin's banners stretching across the coastal plain like a dark tide of silk and steel. 20,000 of Islam's finest warriors had converged on this strategic port city, their scimitars glinting in the heat haze. Richard commanded exactly 2,000 exhausted men, including just 54 knights still capable of mounted combat and a handful of war horses that had survived 3 years of brutal campaigning. The mathematics were beyond hopeless. 10-to-1 odds against the greatest military mind in the Islamic world, fighting on ground of Saladin's choosing with an army that had just achieved its greatest strategic victory of the Third Crusade. Before we descend into 4 days of the most revolutionary amphibious and cavalry warfare in Crusader history, hit that subscribe button for medieval spirits, because what you're about to discover is how Richard the Lionheart with 2,000 men, including 54 mounted knights, faced Saladin's 20,000 at Jaffa after the Sultan captured the strategic port in 18 hours, while Richard was securing Acre 80 miles north. How Richard force-marched 80 miles in 48 hours, covering hostile territory so fast his baggage train fell 20 miles behind and was never seen again. How on August 6th dawn he launched the first amphibious assault in medieval warfare. 35 galleys reinforced as floating fortresses, with Genoese crossbowmen providing covering fire, while 60 knights in 70 pounds of mail waded through surf, using shields as flotation devices. How 3 simultaneous beach landings divided Muslim defenders who expected single-point assault. How Saladin's counterattack at sunset with 20,000 from 3 directions met Richard's improvised harbor fortress using ship anchors as barricades, iron chains to trip cavalry, and galley masts as elevated crossbow platforms. And how at 7 a.m., August 8th, Richard led 54 knights, 1,500-pound destriers carrying 70 pounds of mail at 25 miles per hour in a suicidal charge that routed 20,000 warriors in 17 minutes, killing 700 Muslims while losing only 2 crusaders. This is how tactical genius achieved the impossible while proving strategic limitations. Now let's go back to August 5th and watch Richard choose between certain retreat and almost certain death. Picture this impossible trap as it had developed with the surgical precision that marked Saladin's tactical genius. While Richard had been securing Acre 80 miles to the north, the Sultan had struck Jaffa with lightning speed, overwhelming the Crusader garrison through a perfectly coordinated land and sea assault. The port city that served as the Crusaders' primary supply base for any advance on Jerusalem had fallen in 18 hours, its defenders scattered or dead, its warehouses full of grain and weapons now feeding Muslim armies. Richard's entire strategic position in the Holy Land hung by the thread of this single coastal fortress. The loss of Jaffa represented more than tactical defeat. It was strategic catastrophe that threatened to unravel 3 years of Crusader gains. Without this port, Richard's army would be cut off from European reinforcements and supplies. The overland route to Jerusalem, which had seemed within reach after victories at Acre and Arsuf, now became logistically impossible. But here's what Muslim chroniclers couldn't explain about Richard's response to this disaster. Any rational commander would have negotiated terms, secured safe passage for his remaining forces, and retreated to Acre to minimize losses. The strategic situation was hopeless. The tactical odds were suicidal. Even Richard's own nobles advised immediate withdrawal rather than risk total destruction of English military power in a futile gesture. Yet, the king, who had earned his reputation through 3 years of impossible victories, was about to attempt something that defied every principle of medieval warfare. Richard's forced march south from Acre revealed both the desperation and determination that had made him the most feared Christian warrior in the Levant. His army moved at a pace that killed horses and broke men, covering 80 miles of hostile territory in 48 hours while under constant harassment from Saladin's scouts. Knights rode double when their mounts collapsed. Infantry discarded armor they could no longer carry. The baggage train, slowed by wounded and supplies, fell 20 miles behind the main force and was never seen again. By the time Richard's banners appeared on the hills overlooking Jaffa, his army resembled refugees more than the elite force that had terrorized Muslim armies from Cyprus to Cairo. The arithmetic of desperation revealed itself as Richard surveyed Jaffa's defenses through his brass spyglass. 20,000 Muslim warriors occupied not just the city but the surrounding hills, their cavalry patrols controlling every approach route. Saladin himself commanded from a silk pavilion whose golden eagle banner could be seen from the harbor. Most critically, the garrison that might have supported a rescue operation had been eliminated. Richard would have to retake a fortified city defended by overwhelming force, using troops who could barely stand from exhaustion. As evening fell on August 5th, both armies understood that the next 24 hours would determine not just the fate of Jaffa or the Third Crusade, but the entire balance of power between Christianity and Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean. Richard faced a choice between certain defeat and almost certain death. What he chose would prove that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who understand when mathematics become irrelevant. And Richard was about to invent amphibious warfare. Dawn on August 6th revealed the tactical nightmare that Richard had chosen to embrace rather than flee. Saladin's army sprawled across the coastal plain in perfect order, their white and green banners snapping in the Mediterranean breeze as 20,000 warriors prepared for what should have been a massacre disguised as a siege. From the harbor, where Richard's 35 galleys bobbed at anchor like floating coffins, the sight was overwhelming. Muslim cavalry patrols controlled every beach approach, while archers lined the city walls in such density that their arrow volleys could darken the noon sky. The port that had taken Saladin's forces 18 hours to capture would have to be retaken by a force 1/10 their size, with no element of surprise. But Richard had spent the sleepless night transforming his apparent disadvantage into something medieval warfare had never witnessed: an amphibious assault designed to turn the Mediterranean itself into his most powerful weapon. His ship's carpenters had worked through darkness to reinforce galley sides with additional planking, creating floating fortresses that could approach the beach while protecting crossbowmen from return fire. The innovation was born of pure desperation, but it represented a tactical revolution that would influence naval warfare for centuries. Medieval combat was about to become three-dimensional. The first challenge was basic physics made deadly by enemy arrows. 60 knights wearing 70 pounds of mail each would have to wade through surf while under concentrated fire from Muslim archers positioned on Jaffa's seawalls. The weight that made their armor effective on land became potentially fatal in water. A single crossbow bolt finding its mark could drown a knight as efficiently as it could kill him. Richard's solution was characteristically audacious. Ship-based crossbowmen would provide suppressing fire, while knights used their shields as primitive flotation devices during the wade to shore. As the sun reached its merciless peak at midday, Richard's galleys began their approach to Jaffa's harbor with precision that amazed both friend and foe. Each vessel carried 40 Genoese crossbowmen, whose accuracy had been perfected through decades of Mediterranean warfare. Their steel-tipped bolts could penetrate mail at 100 yards, making them lethally effective against Muslim defenders whose lighter armor emphasized mobility over protection. The psychological impact was immediate. Defenders accustomed to fighting land-based enemies suddenly faced attack from an angle they had never prepared for. What happened next defied every assumption about medieval siege warfare. As Richard's lead galley grounded in the shallows, Muslim archers unleashed clouds of arrows that should have turned the water crimson with Crusader blood. Instead, the reinforced ship sides deflected most shafts, while crossbow volleys from remaining vessels systematically cleared sections of the seawall. The exchange rate was catastrophically favorable to attackers. Muslim archers, exposed on walls, suffered devastating casualties, while Crusader knights remained protected until the moment of actual landing. And Richard was about to demonstrate that surprise doesn't require secrecy, it requires doing what your enemy thinks is impossible. Here's where Richard's tactical genius became visible through the chaos of amphibious combat. Instead of attempting a single massive landing that would concentrate all his forces at one vulnerable point, the Lionheart coordinated simultaneous assaults at 3 different beaches. Muslim defenders, expecting to overwhelm a concentrated force, found themselves facing multiple threats that divided their attention and firepower. As units rushed to defend one landing site, they left other approaches virtually unguarded. The wade through the surf revealed why Richard commanded such legendary devotion from his men. The king himself led the central assault, his distinctive golden surcoat making him an obvious target for every Muslim archer within range. Knights who had served under lesser commanders would have hesitated at the water's edge, calculating their chances of survival. Richard's men followed him into the Mediterranean without question, their shields locked above their heads like scales on some mythical sea monster emerging from the depths. Picture this from a Muslim defender's perspective. You're positioned on Jaffa's seawall, confident that any landing attempt will be suicidal. Suddenly, you see 3 separate groups of armored knights wading through surf while arrows bounce off their shields, led by a king in golden armor who seems immune to fear, or arrows. The psychological impact is immediate if their supreme commander thinks this is survivable. What terrifying warriors follow him? By 3 p.m., the impossible had become reality. Crusader knights were fighting in Jaffa's narrow streets, while their comrades continued landing on beaches that should have been killing grounds. Muslim defenders, caught between seaborne assault and their own tactical confusion, began falling back toward the city center. The urban geography that should have favored defenders' narrow alleys, stone buildings, perfect for archery, instead became a maze where heavily armored knights could corner and destroy lighter-armed opponents in close combat. But then everything accelerated toward crisis. Saladin's main force, positioned outside the city walls, began their counterstroke with the methodical precision that had made the Sultan master of Syria and Egypt. 20,000 fresh warriors started moving toward Jaffa's gates, while Richard's exhausted knights fought building by building through streets slick with blood. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Even if Richard captured the harbor district, he lacked forces to hold it against Saladin's inevitable counterattack. The amphibious miracle that had achieved the impossible was about to collide with strategic mathematics that made ultimate victory seemingly beyond reach. As Muslim war cries echoed from the approaching army, the question became whether Richard's innovation had bought salvation or merely delayed annihilation. And Saladin was about to demonstrate why he'd never lost a campaign by personally directing 20,000 warriors toward the harbor where Richard's tiny force was trapped with water at their backs. Saladin's counterattack began at sunset on August 6th with the overwhelming force that had conquered Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo. 20,000 warriors converged on Jaffa from 3 directions simultaneously, their war cries echoing off limestone walls as the greatest military mind in the Islamic world prepared to crush Richard's amphibious miracle through sheer mathematical superiority. The Sultan had spent precious hours allowing the Crusaders to establish their beachhead, but his patience was strategic rather than indecisive. By waiting until his full force could coordinate, Saladin ensured that Richard's tactical innovation would meet systematic annihilation rather than piecemeal resistance. Richard's response revealed why 3 years of brutal campaigning had forged him into something more dangerous than a mere warrior king. Instead of attempting to hold Jaffa's sprawling defenses with his tiny force, the Lionheart concentrated his men in the harbor district, where his ships could provide continuous fire support. Using materials salvaged from captured Muslim siege engines, his engineers transformed the waterfront into an improvised fortress that maximized every advantage medieval technology could provide. Ship anchors became foundation stones for hastily erected barricades. Iron chains intended for harbor defense were repositioned to trip cavalry charges. Most ingeniously, galley masts were converted into elevated platforms for crossbowmen who could fire down at attacking infantry. The first Muslim assault struck Jaffa's makeshift defenses like a bronze-tipped tsunami crashing against a seawall built from desperation and tactical genius. 8,000 infantry, supported by 5,000 cavalry, thundered toward Richard's position with the confidence of warriors who had never failed to overwhelm numerically inferior enemies. The sound was beyond human comprehension. 13,000 men charging across limestone pavement while screaming prayers that promised paradise to those who died killing Christians. Here's what made Richard's improvised fortifications truly revolutionary. The harbor district's irregular layout channeled attacking forces into narrow approaches where numerical superiority became meaningless. Muslim infantry found themselves advancing through corridors barely 10 feet wide, while crossbow bolts erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. At point-blank range, Genoese crossbows could punch through mail, leather, and bone with mechanical precision that made individual skill irrelevant. The exchange rates became immediately catastrophic for Saladin's forces. In the first 30 minutes of assault, Muslim casualties exceeded 400 dead, while Crusader losses numbered fewer than 20. Muslim warriors accustomed to fluid cavalry combat found themselves trapped in grinding infantry battles, where their mobility advantages disappeared. You're probably wondering how Richard's ships could remain effective during land combat. The answer was about to transform naval warfare doctrine. When Muslim attacks concentrated on one section, galley-mounted crossbowmen could reposition to provide enfilading fire. When cavalry attempted to outflank land-based defenses, ship-based archers could rake their formations from unexpected angles. The harbor that had seemed like a trap became Richard's greatest tactical asset. But Saladin wasn't finished, and the Sultan was about to force Richard into a gamble that would either create legends or destroy them. But Saladin wasn't simply throwing men against prepared positions. The Sultan, who had outmaneuvered Richard at Hattin, was systematically probing for weaknesses, while building pressure that would eventually exceed defensive capabilities. Muslim engineers began constructing mangonels within range of the harbor district, their stone projectiles designed to collapse Richard's improvised fortifications through concentrated bombardment. More ominously, Saladin's cavalry had begun interdicting the beaches where Crusader supplies and reinforcements would have to land. The psychological pressure on Richard's defenders was becoming unbearable. Each assault wave grew larger and more coordinated. Muslim arrows fell in such density that movement between positions became potentially fatal. Worst of all, the mathematical reality was inescapable. Saladin could afford to lose 10 men for every Crusader casualty and still achieve overwhelming victory. Then came the intelligence that would force both commanders to gamble everything on one decisive action. Muslim spies reported that a Crusader relief column was approaching from Acre, though its size remained unknown. Saladin faced the nightmare scenario that had haunted his strategic planning: fighting Richard's entrenched force while simultaneously dealing with external reinforcement. The Sultan, who had spent 3 days methodically grinding down Crusader resistance, now had to choose between patient siege warfare and immediate decisive assault. By the night of August 7th, both Richard and Saladin understood that tactical maneuvering had reached its limit. The dawn of August 8th would bring the moment that would either immortalize Richard Plantagenet or mark his final defeat at the hands of the greatest Muslim general in history. Saladin spent the night positioning his entire army for what he knew must be the decisive assault. 20,000 warriors formed a crescent around Jaffa's harbor district, their scimitars catching the first light as drums echoed across the limestone walls with rhythms that had terrified Christian armies from Hattin to Ascalon. The Sultan himself took position where he could observe Richard's destruction, confident that overwhelming numbers would finally crush the tactical genius that had frustrated Islamic conquest for 3 brutal years. Richard's response defied every principle of defensive warfare that had governed medieval combat since Hastings. Instead of waiting behind his improvised fortifications for the Muslim assault, the Lionheart gathered his 54 remaining mounted knights in the harbor square and prepared for something that military historians still consider the most audacious tactical decision in Crusader history. 54 heavy cavalry would charge directly into 20,000 enemy troops across open ground, with no possibility of retreat. The mathematics were beyond suicidal, they were mathematically impossible. And Saladin was about to learn that some victories belong to those who refuse to accept mathematics. Here's where Richard's understanding of medieval psychology transcended mere tactical calculation. The king who had studied Saladin's methods for 3 years understood that Muslim morale depended on the assumption of inevitable victory through superior numbers. A charge that should have resulted in instant annihilation might instead create psychological shock that could shatter enemy cohesion before numerical superiority became decisive. It was a gamble that staked everything on the power of individual courage to overcome mathematical certainty. The charge began at precisely 7 a.m., with a sound that seemed to crack the very foundations of Jaffa's limestone walls. 54 destriers, each weighing over 1,500 pounds and carrying a knight in 70 pounds of mail, thundered across the harbor square toward Saladin's amazed army. Their 12-foot ash lances tipped with steel points designed to punch through any armor, couched in perfect formation as Richard himself led the wedge that would either achieve the impossible or provide Saladin with the most spectacular victory in Islamic military history. The impact was beyond human comprehension. 54 knights moving at 25 miles per hour struck Muslim infantry with the kinetic force of a medieval avalanche. Lance points found their targets with mechanical precision, while warhorse hooves trampled everything in their path. The front ranks of Saladin's army simply disintegrated under impact forces that medieval engineering had specifically designed to make unstoppable. In the first 30 seconds, 200 Muslim warriors lay dead or dying, while not a single knight had fallen. Richard himself became the focal point of combat that reached mythical proportions. The king, whose golden surcoat made him visible across the entire battlefield, carved a path through enemy ranks with sword strokes that contemporary chroniclers described as superhuman. Muslim warriors who had conquered from Baghdad to Cairo found themselves fleeing from a single mounted figure whose blade seemed to be everywhere at once. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. If Richard Lionheart could not be stopped by overwhelming numbers, what hope did mere mortals have? The rout began within 17 minutes of the charge's initiation. Elite Muslim units that had never retreated in their lives suddenly broke ranks and fled toward the hills surrounding Jaffa. The mathematical impossibility was becoming historical reality as 54 knights systematically destroyed the cohesion of an army that outnumbered them 370 to 1. Saladin watched in growing horror as his carefully coordinated assault dissolved into panic that spread through his ranks like wildfire through dry grass. What Saladin witnessed next challenged every assumption he held about the relationship between numbers and victory. As his cavalry attempted to rally and surround Richard's tiny force, the Crusader knights didn't scatter as tactical doctrine demanded. Instead, they maintained formation and continued their advance, cutting through successive lines of Muslim resistance with mechanical precision that made their small numbers irrelevant. Each knight was accounting for dozens of enemies, while suffering casualties that could be counted on one hand. And then came the moment that would haunt Saladin for the rest of his legendary career. The climactic moment came when Richard's charge reached Saladin's command position, forcing the Sultan himself to flee from a battlefield for the first time in his legendary career. Muslim chronicles would later claim that Saladin withdrew to maintain strategic perspective, but eyewitness accounts describe a panicked retreat as the commander, who had humiliated the finest Christian armies, found himself personally threatened by a king he had considered defeated. Within 1 hour of the charge's beginning, Saladin's entire army was in full retreat toward Damascus, abandoning equipment worth a kingdom's ransom and leaving behind casualty figures that defied belief. 700 Muslim dead against 2 Crusader losses. The army that had seemed destined to complete Islam's conquest of the Levant was fleeing in panic from a force that could have fit into a single church. As the dust settled across Jaffa's blood-soaked harbor, the impossible mathematics of Richard's victory became starkly visible in the afternoon light. 700 Muslim warriors lay scattered across the limestone ground, their bodies forming a grotesque testament to what 54 heavy cavalry could accomplish when desperation meant perfect tactical execution. Against this oceanic loss, Crusader casualties numbered exactly 2 dead, a sergeant-at-arms struck down during the initial charge, and a knight who had fallen from his wounded destrier during the pursuit. By any measure of medieval combat effectiveness, Jaffa represented the most lopsided victory in recorded military history. The treasure abandoned by Saladin's fleeing army revealed the extent of Muslim confidence that had been shattered by Richard's charge. Siege engines worth 10,000 bezants lay scattered across the plain, their crews having fled so precipitously that they abandoned equipment representing months of skilled craftsmanship. Most tellingly, Saladin's personal banner, the Golden Eagle that had flown over Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, remained planted in the ground, where the Sultan had abandoned his command position. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed on September 2nd, 1192, marked the end of the Third Crusade with terms that reflected the strange equilibrium Richard's impossible victory had created. Saladin, despite suffering his most humiliating tactical defeat, retained control of Jerusalem and the strategic centers of Muslim power throughout Palestine. Richard, despite achieving tactical perfection that would echo through military legend, departed the Holy Land without accomplishing the primary objective that had brought him east 3 years earlier. The agreement granted Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem's holy sites, while acknowledging that the city would remain under Islamic rule indefinitely. The strategic revolution that followed Jaffa rippled across medieval Europe as news of Richard's charge spread through courts from London to Constantinople. Heavy cavalry tactics crystallized around the model of concentrated shock action that had shattered Saladin's army. Military treatises written in the following decades analyzed the precise formations, timing, and psychological factors that had made 54 knights capable of routing 20,000 infantry. August 5th, 1192. Richard Plantagenet faced mathematical impossibility with 2,000 exhausted men, including 54 mounted knights, against Saladin's 20,000 warriors at Jaffa. When the bronze dust settled over the limestone harbor 4 days later, the Lionheart had proven something that would echo through military history. 54 destriers at 1,500 pounds each, carrying 70 pounds of mail, moving at 25 miles per hour, could generate enough kinetic force to rout an army 370 times their number. The mathematics revealed a devastating truth. 700 Muslim dead versus 2 Crusader casualties in 17 minutes of charging proved that perfect courage and flawless execution overcome any numerical disadvantage when properly applied. So here's what you need to understand about Jaffa. The mathematics weren't just about cavalry charges or amphibious innovation. They were about recognizing that revolutionary tactics create psychological shock, that ships can become floating fortresses, that improvised defenses multiply defensive power, that sometimes the most audacious choice is the only rational one. Richard invented amphibious warfare on August 6th using 35 galleys as floating fortresses with Genoese crossbowmen providing covering fire during 3 simultaneous beach landings. He transformed Jaffa's harbor into an integrated fortress, using ship anchors as barricades, iron chains to trip cavalry, galley masts as crossbow platforms, innovations that inflicted 400 Muslim casualties in 30 minutes for 20 Crusaders. And at 7 a.m. August 8th, he led 54 knights in a charge that physics said would work, but psychology had to deliver. Subscribe to Medieval Spirits and share this video so others understand how tactical innovation defeats numerical superiority when executed with perfect timing. Leave a comment telling me which modern operation best demonstrates Richard's principles: amphibious assault coordination, improvised defensive integration, concentrated armor shock, and psychological warfare through audacious action. Because here's the real lesson from Jaffa. Sometimes the greatest victories require inventing entirely new forms of warfare, when conventional tactics offer only defeat. Richard chose amphibious assault when land routes were blocked, improvised fortresses when static defenses were impossible, and 54 night charges when defensive fighting meant slow annihilation. 4 days later, 700 Ottoman corpses proved that revolutionary tactics executed with perfect courage defeat any mathematical disadvantage. Sometimes impossibility exists to be overcome by those audacious enough to rewrite warfare's rules.